Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. My topic for tonight is ATACMS and the Russian response. And there is Dee. Hello, Dee. How are you? Thank you for sharing. I'm going to move right into our topic I'm going to go over some of the live stream this morning from the Jamarl Thomas Morning Show. Very interesting clips from these shows. I'll go over them and do commentary. Let me share them.
Has said very clearly, firing long-range strikes is a red line. And because he noted this is a red line, then you're stuck with that. And your credibility demands that you do something about that. Now, I pointed out over and over again that up to this point, the West had considered all notions of pragmatism by Putin as weakness. Meaning Putin's attempts at trying to avoid a war were seen by the West as he's weak. He's not really in for it. We can continuously push and escalate, especially after Joe Biden loses or Kamala Harris loses the race and the American public effectively says, stop. We have no confidence in you. And not just no confidence in you. We trust the other guy on foreign policy more. The guy that says he wants to end wars as opposed to start wars. Specifically, this war. It was litigated in the race. Joe Biden knows, or at the very least believes, that this grift of hundreds of billions of US dollars pissed away on this geopolitical project to expand Western influence into Ukraine, and let's be honest, also to stick it to the Russians, the jig is up. At least they think so. And so they have started to escalate over the course of the next 2 months and the time that Joe Biden has remaining. I would imagine to try to ingratiate Ukraine further into NATO under this belief.
I think he means to integrate Ukraine further into NATO.
That Putin is bluffing. And I would imagine in their mind, if Putin is bluffing, if Putin doesn't respond, they would go further, and they would go further, and they would go further, up to potentially putting forces into Ukraine.
So Jamarl is talking about the importance of a reply by the Russians, okay, to this initiative of Joe Biden's. Because from their point of view, the Russian point of view, if they don't stop this here, then the West, NATO, will continue to escalate.
So my point that I made yesterday was that any response by Russia has to be significant enough to get across. We are not joking. We are not playing with you. We are deadly serious. We changed the nuclear doctrine. That should have been a heads up. We are on nuclear alert, according to Colonel. Oh, I can't think of his name. It'll come to.
I think it was Colonel McGregor who said just yesterday that Russia went on to a nuclear alert. Colonel McGregor was very alarmed by this, of course.
In a moment.
This is why your blood sugar spikes and feet burns. Did you know type 2 diabetes is a completely reversible condition? You may not know.
And we have warned you that this is a no-go. Last night, they fulfilled the obligations that I put forth, and they launched an ICBM for the first time in this conflict. And it got across a few things. One, that Russia was fighting this with its arm tied behind his back. Because the fact of the matter is they've been fighting this war in a very specific way without using all the elements of their power to fight this war. And the fact that the ICBM missile, intercontinental ballistic missile, is just now being launched, it's to make a point. This was Sergei Lavrov. The United States never actually came out to say that they changed policy. They just changed policy. And it was reported in the media. And then you get missiles fired by Ukraine almost immediately. And then you get Storm Shadow missiles fired immediately after. At which point, I said, they are going to have to do something dramatic to get across their seriousness. And it can't be minor. It has to be clear. Lavrov came out and said this. Effectively, we're in a new stage of the war.
Decision of the United States to allow Ukrainian regime to use missiles up to 300 kilometers long. We read what the New York Times published about this. There are still no confirmation either from the White House or from the Pentagon.
And so there's still no confirmation from the White House and the Pentagon that they gave the Ukrainians permission to fire the ATACMS into to Russia proper. Now, previously, they had used ATACMS to attack in Crimea, which the Russians considered Russia. Okay, but at least it was a disputed area. They never used ATACMS before to fire into to Russia proper. So this time the Ukrainians did that. They fired the ATACMS into Kursk. Putin had warned about that. And so he retaliated with what is here called an ICBM. As we go through the various sources, you will see it wasn't really an ICBM, but it was a very, very powerful missile nonetheless.
But we basically take our position on the basis of what is going on physically. And physically, ATACMS, apparently not as long as 300 kilometers, are being used, including this early morning in Russia, against the Bryansk Oblast of Russia, which is bordering Ukraine. And we proceed from the understanding that this is happening, and that any modification of ATACMS cannot be used without American experts and instructors, including satellite data, including programming and targeting. The president mentioned this several times. If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia.
A quantitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia. Last night, there were reports that an ICBM had been launched. And there were reports that effectively a missile barrage, but one ICBM. It looked like this falling from the sky at obscene speeds. Now, what you're seeing are 6 of them landing. Now, the reason that they're 6 is because this particular warhead breaks out into 6 different warheads. From my understanding, this warhead could also carry nuclear weapons.
But in this case, it did not. It carried only conventional weapons, and the 6 warheads from the single missile were used to destroy a weapons manufacturing installation, one that actually produced various kinds of missiles itself. So Russia was intending to hit a military target, but not a civilian target. It was looking to demonstrate that if the war continued, and if U.S. people based in Ukraine continue to fire the missiles into Russia, that the next escalation by the Russians would be much more serious.
Meaning the ICBM didn't have to be used in the situation for them to accomplish the objective. They used it specifically to make the point: A, this can hit anywhere in Ukraine; B, this can hit anywhere in Europe; C, you can't stop it, meaning you can't do anything about it. When it's fired, it's going to hit its target. This is what it apparently looks like.
Okay, watch this.
Right here. Avant-garde warheads, top speed 33,000 kilometers per hour. This particular one, it can have different types of warheads, so it doesn't necessarily have to have the breaking out in the 6 warheads. It's just so happened that this is the type that breaks out. It can have multiple different warheads. In having multiple different warheads, one of those warheads, it could be many actually, but it's a nuclear capable missile. It's a nuclear capable missile. This specific one is called the RS-24 YARS. To 5,000 kilometers, again, depending upon the warhead that's being used. This specific one functions like this. Turns into
Looks like there was
warheads.
7 warheads there, doesn't it?
Those warheads can hit different targets within a certain radius of itself. Hence, that ends up screaming into Earth.
Okay, the 33,000 kilometers per hour is equal to 19,000 kilometers per hour. There was a later claim that was made that the hypersonic missiles were running at a Mach 10 speed. I think that's more like, maybe 10,000 miles per hour, but definitely hypersonic and definitely impossible for our aircraft defenses to shoot down. Let's sort of skip ahead a little. Jamarl brings Scott Ritter into the program.
This incredible product dissolves oven grease and stubborn mold in seconds without any scrubbing. Take any dirty surface, spray over the grease.
The person to talk to today, it's just so happened that you said yes, and just so happened this happened overnight. Scott, let me bring you in. Scott Ritter is a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Telegram at Scott Ritter. How you doing this morning, Scott? You doing all right?
I'm doing well, thank you. Yourself?
I am doing okay. A bit freaked out and a bit concerned at the events that are taking place. Let's start at the beginning. I listened to your talk on the issue for Joe Biden, and I agree with you. I agree with you 1,000%. Up to this point, every action that Putin has taken that has been pragmatic has been accepted or seen through this lens of weakness. He's bluffing. He's weak, despite the fact that what they've been doing was trying to prevent a larger war. Joe Biden, on his way out, despite democratically fail, gets lamed up, and on his way out decides to escalate in a way that Putin is defined as being a red line. Why is Joe Biden doing this? Is it the innocent answer of, well, he's doing this for posterity, so in 1,000 years when they look back, they could say, well, he did everything he could to keep Ukraine in the Western sphere of influence? Or is it the more cynical reason of, we are going to pull Ukraine as far into NATO, let's say, ideals and contexts in this next 2 months? Basically, we are going to accelerate this notion of ingratiating NATO or NATO tactics into Ukraine. What is it? Why is Joe Biden doing this now?
Well, first of all, I don't know if Joe Biden's doing anything now. He's clearly a diminished man. Whether or not he is capable of the cognitive processes required to make complex national security decision making is a legitimate question that everybody should be asking. What we do know is that there was a split in his administration about this very issue, whether or not to allow Ukraine to use U.S. provided ATACMS missiles to strike targets in Russia. We know that back in September, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin articulated very strongly against this policy, understanding that these weapons would not contribute to a Ukrainian victory. Ukraine was still going to lose this war. As Austin said, the only way out of this conflict is through negotiation, and also the recognition that by doing so, this could lead to an escalation, the consequences of which are unpredictable. Secretary of State Tony Blinken had a different approach. There was an approach that I think even in September, prior to the election, was premised on the fear of a Trump victory and the need for the United States to do something that protected NATO and Ukraine from a potential Trump administration. And what they needed to do is get NATO and Ukraine so closely entwined together, in effect, to make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO with NATO military presence on the soil, etc., that a Donald Trump administration would not be able to come in and mess that up. The idea was to Trump-proof NATO, Trump-proof Ukraine. In order to do that, you would have to implement policies that represented a radical departure from, past practice, policies that are reflected in the Zelensky 10-point peace plan that he has put out there. That the first measure of which is give us long-range weapons. The next thing he's going to ask for, if you give Ukraine long-range weapons and once again Russia does nothing, the next thing is to say, well, we're going to extend NATO air defense into Western Ukraine, allow Patriot missiles out of Poland to shoot down Russian missiles as they come in to Ukrainian territory. And then the next step would be to put NATO aircraft over Ukraine to engage Russian missiles and cruise missiles. This is what Zelensky is asking for. And then this inevitably leads to boots on the ground, a military presence. And now NATO is in Ukraine, and Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO. This is Trump proofing. It's also a recipe for disaster because it actually takes us down the path of meeting the conditions set by Russia for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, up until now, the West, the Blinkens of the world are saying that Russia is bluffing, that Putin is bluffing, and that's why they can do this. I think today Putin showed that he's not bluffing. He warned that if you use these weapons, these ATACMS missiles, which even the Russians say it doesn't change anything. Ukraine fired 6. 5 were shot down. 1 got hit in the air, broke up coming in, did some damage. That's not the point. The point is Russia understands the escalation that's taking place. That if you don't nip this in the bud now, the next thing you know, you have Poland saying they're going to extend their air defense. And now you have a bigger crisis. So the time to act is now, and that's what they've done. They've fired a missile, which under certain configurations could be classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile. Under other configurations is an intermediate range missile. But the bottom line is, for the first time in the history of war, I'll say it one more time, for the first time in the history of war, an ICBM has been fired in combat. And there's nothing the West can do. They can't stop it. They can't shoot it down. And it used a warhead. I think when the battle damage assessment comes in, the warhead type that was used, which we had not, I've been following this for a long time. Maybe people in the Pentagon who have access to the top secret information, had a clue that this was up, but most discussions had this missile, which is called the RS-26 Rubiège or Frontier. It wasn't RS-24. The Rubiège is actually
Okay, so Scott is saying, okay, it's a Rubiège missile, okay, so-called, and that it wasn't an RS-24, it was an RS-26. Later on in the day, he corrects that, though. It was actually an entirely new missile configuration that Russia used in this instance, but we'll cover that a little later in this show. So back to Scott.
The first 2 stages of the RS-24. The RS-24 is a 3-stage ICBM. The Rubiège uses the first 2 stages of it. We had thought it either has a nuclear warhead, or it could have 3 avant-garde, which was what you were showing there, the avant-garde hypersonic reentry vehicles. But nowhere have I read that it could have a conventional payload of up to 6 cassette type warheads. That meaning, when I say that, each one of these 6 warheads has 6 submunitions in it. So there's 36 total munitions striking the ground at very high speed with extreme accuracy, bringing a lot of damage in a very isolated place. This wasn't on my radar, and I don't know if it was on anybody's radar who didn't have access to the most sensitive intelligence information in the United States. And I'm even wondering if the United States was aware that this warhead type was available for the Rubiège. The Russians did this, sending a signal that they can strike anywhere in Europe, anytime they want, with non-nuclear power that will destroy whatever target it's aimed at. There's no target safe from the Rubiej. They
For example, it could strike the headquarters of NATO, okay, in Brussels, and destroy that headquarters with conventional warheads.
the Russians just told the Poles, "Hey, you just activated that anti-ballistic missile site, the Mark 41 Aegis ashore. It's dead, and it's not going to require a nuclear weapon to do it. We'll just put a Rubiej on it, and it's das Vidanya." The Putin has been warning about this for some time. I've been tracking this. Back in the summer, Putin appeared to restart the Rubiej production line in Votkinsk. The Rubiej was developed in in 2015, scheduled to come online in 2017, but because it has the ability to be classified as either an intercontinental ballistic missile or an intermediate range missile, the Russians decided not to go forward because they would have to commit to a warhead type for this weapon under the terms of the START treaty, because the INF treaty, which was still the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed in 1987, implemented in 88. I was an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty weapons inspector. In fact, the first one on the ground in the Soviet Union to implement this treaty, a very important treaty. And that treaty prohibited, missiles like the Rubiej that was fired the other day. But Donald Trump withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019, and the Russians said,
And that was really a smart idea by Donald Trump, by the way, wasn't it? It opened the way for the Russians to go ahead with the Rubiej stuff.
have no intention of, even though you withdrew from it, we're not going to build new INF type systems unless you deploy INF type systems to Europe. And unfortunately for the world, the United States did just that. We deployed intermediate range systems in a training exercise in Denmark. And the Russians said, okay. And they opened up the Rubiej production lines. This was sometime in July. Based upon my past experience there and such, the rate of production of a Rubiej, if brought into full-scale production, which the Russians were prepared to do, it's about 6 to 8 missiles a month. And in the time frame, that means they could have produced between 36 and 40 of these missiles, and they're still producing them. So Russia has a sufficient arsenal of these.
But keep in mind, according to what Scott has said, 36 of those missiles, each one carries impact vehicles, 36 each. So we're talking 36 times 36. Of course, each missile would be flattening a particular area, but it would be devastating, that area with 36 separate impacts.
Missiles right now ready to take out all of Europe without nuclear weapons, to destroy Kiev, to take out any target they want. They hadn't used these because this represents a qualitative advance in the war, and Russia was avoiding that. But Russia said, if you use these ATACMS missiles, if you use the Storm Shadow, the Scalp against Russian targets, that's a qualitative advancement, and we will respond and they're not going to respond in kind. Russia just put down the biggest warning you have. This is the first time. I just want your audience to understand that an ICBM has been fired in combat in the history of the world. And the Russians just did it, and there's not a damn thing anybody can do to stop that weapon. And now
But it's not simply an ICBM. It's an ICBM that delivers hypersonic payloads, okay, with hypersonic impact, because the impact of the explosives is much greater when it hits the ground at hypersonic speeds.
they have a bunch of them, and you know, it's game on. Will the West learn its lesson? Will the West back down and understand that you're not going to save Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost this war, and the best way out of this crisis is to get Ukraine to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring an end to this conflict? Or they can continue to deceive themselves into believing that they can push Russia to the point where Russia breaks, that Putin is bluffing. Today proved Putin is not bluffing. And I will tell you this, if we continue, the Rubiège will be used again and again and again to take out targets in Ukraine that will become increasingly painful for the Ukrainians and for us. And if we continue to push, then they will take out targets in Europe.
Well, that's the other catch. This is also capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, which is also the other, I would imagine, warning that is being issued. I mean, you get the...
This is the sharpest knife I've ever used. Check it out. It's the Japanese chef's knife that's winning thousands of reviews from...
changing of the nuclear guidelines or the nuclear policy. And then you get a missile, ICBM, first time ever fired, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead on top of that. I don't necessarily think those things are separate from one another. I don't think they're a coincidence. That has to be part of the message that is being sent using this weapon, correct?
Look, they just published. I mean, they published the idea of a modified, updated nuclear posture, nuclear employment doctrine.
Right.
Putin discussed that back in September when he met with his leadership. He just signed that into law on November 19th.
Right.
And he has said straight up, if you attack us with these missiles, we can use nuclear weapons against you. And of course, now the United States has in effect attacked Russia with these weapons. These weapons could not be fired without American assistance, American direction, American permission. So from the Russian perspective, the United States has attacked Russia. And so now they have fired a weapon system, which you're 100% correct, is fully capable of carrying between 1 and 3 nuclear warheads. And I think Russia's putting the marker down, saying this time we use conventional. We're fully capable of using nuclear weapons on this too. And if you want to keep pushing the envelope, we just told you what the doctrine is. It shouldn't come as a surprise if we in fact nuke you.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Do you think after this demonstration, because my point of view the other day was that Russia is going to have to respond in a way that is significant enough to get across we are serious and we are not messing around. Basically, it's almost like you have to be strong enough to get across that you're willing to end the world in order to get them to not continue to escalate. Otherwise, they take your weaknesses or your pragmatism as weakness. Do you think that they are going to, and I guess this kind of depends on what Joe Biden's objective is, or whoever's running the show objective is. Is their objective ultimately war? Or is it that they're pushing the envelope, seeing to how far they can push without going over the cliff? This kind of brinksmanship. Where do you think they are on this? Meaning, do you think they take this demonstration for the seriousness that it deserves? And if they don't, what would be the next escalation from your point of view?
Well, let's start first of all with why Russia did what it did. I mean, they've introduced a dramatic new weapon. The target they hit is a missile factory. The former Yuzhmash missile factory used to produce Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Ukrainians renamed it, and they produce missile-related technology. Right now, Ukraine is saying that they're producing their own ballistic missiles to be used to strike Russia. Well, they ain't going to be producing them at the Yuzhmash factory anymore. The Yuzhmash factory no longer exists because of what Russia just did. So, I mean, that was the signal that, look, we can do this. There had been hints that Russia would have used a weapon like that against Kiev, against Bankova Street, to take out the Ukrainian government, but they did not. Instead, they struck a legitimate military target, which is in keeping with Russia's approach so far, which is not to, turn this into a nation-killing exercise. But the next step will be to kill the Ukrainian government. And I think that's the message that needs to be played out here in the West, is that Russia just demonstrated the ability to take out the Ukrainian government using non-nuclear power. They did not do so because they're giving the West a chance to change its policy direction.
You're so right.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say,
I hope the West hears this message. I know there will be a debate in NATO. Hopefully, those who say Russia's bluffing no longer will say that, but there will be some who will say, well, they didn't hit Kiev, though. They're scared. They hit Dnipropetrovsk. It's not the decisive step that they said. We still don't think that they'll follow through, and they may seek to escalate. But if they do that, what this has done is it built in an additional escalatory step that Russia can take before it has to attack Europe. But the next step will be to take out Kiev. And the next step after that will be to strike European targets. And then the next step after that is nuclear war. So we're literally 3 steps away from the world ending.
Okay, so those were the great points that were made by Scott. And I thought that his analysis there was impeccable. And I am expecting that if we continue to use the ATACMS, then Russia is next going to reply with a decapitation strike directed at the government, in Kiev. And I think that's the next step terms of what we ought to be expecting. Now, I'm going to consider some comments of yours now, and then I'm going to go into some other videos that appeared, somewhat later in the day. Okay, another one with Scott involved, and another one with Colonel McGregor involved also. Solana says, hi, hi. Dawn Foster says, I'm here. Evelina says, hi, all. Robert Cope says, I don't trust Scott Ritter as he seems biased in favor of Russia. Okay, Robert, hi. Russia is forcing Ukraine into NATO, but Scott Ritter is too stupid to realize that. Robert, I think what's happened, is that Ukraine decided long ago that it wanted to go into NATO, and Russia invaded Ukraine with, the special military operation because it wanted to put a stop to that. So that was already a fact on the ground, and Russia has been putting a stop to that, and right now, that will never happen. Evelina says, daunting weapons. Lana says, please make sure that you hit that like button. Robert says, I just hit the unsubscribe button as I would rather listen to domestic issues. Look at how many people subscribe to this channel, and the channel is not growing, at all. Well, from the standpoint of subscriptions, it might not be growing, Robert, but from the standpoint of attendance, it is surely growing. My indicator says that there are 57 people here now. You have to remember that I'm streaming not just to YouTube, but to Facebook and Twitter, as well. My indicator says there are 56 people here now, but I think the indicator tends to underestimate. I'm probably looking at more like 70 or 75 people. So there's no question that this channel has been growing, just not on YouTube where you are. Anyway, it's time to go to the second of our pieces tonight. So let me pull that up. I've been pulling up only one piece at a time because this is from Judging Freedom, and the interview Judge Napolitano had later in the afternoon with Scott Ritter. I'm going to skip forward because I don't want to focus on Israel. So let's skip forward.
the nations responsible. And he blamed the United States and Great Britain directly. So we may see him extend this, for instance, taking out the American missile facility that just the ballistic missile defense facility that just opened up in Poland, or take out the other one in Romania to strike British targets in the region. So, and once that does, then we create the possibility of NATO figuring Article 5. Now we're a conflict between Russia and NATO, and we all die. That's how dangerous this is. We are very, very close to reaching the point of no return when it comes to nuclear war. And keep in mind that just within the last 24 hours, Rear Admiral Buchanan of the United States Strategic Command came out and issued a statement in response to the news that Vladimir Putin had signed off on a new nuclear doctrine. And he said that the United States prepared to engage in a nuclear exchange with Russia, that we believe we can win, and that we won't use all our nuclear force because we're going to win and still maintain nuclear deterrence against the rest of the world. Let me say that one more time so the audience understands what I just said. The United States is prepared to engage in a nuclear exchange with Russia that we think we can win. I would have liked to ask him which cities he's willing to give away in this exchange, and what population numbers is he talking about? Is he talking about only 6 million dead, or are we going to lose?
Well, this admiral is a lunatic. Could the White House possibly, well, the White House is filled with lunacy as well, have authorized something as provocative and absurd as this?
Well, this is a fair question. I mean, somebody had to authorize him to make this statement, but it's a grossly irresponsible statement to make at this time. Let me tell you why. Because if I'm a Russian listening to that, that tells me that the Americans believe they can fight a limited nuclear war and win it. That means that the Americans have gone crazy from the standpoint of the Russians. They're preparing to win it. When you say that you're going to retain sufficient stockpiles to continue deterrence posture, that means that you're probably thinking about a preemptive strike against the Russians to take out Russia's capabilities, because that's the only way an exchange works, that you can walk away from. You can't ride out a Russian attack. Russia has enough capability to just flatten every aspect of the United States. But if we
what is this admiral's name again, Scott?
Buchanan. You're
as you'll see later, he's evidently a rear admiral. So he's a 2-star, he's a 1-star or a 2-star probably, not a 4-star. So it's likely he came up with this by himself, but we'll get into that, a little later.
Admiral Buchanan. If you Google it,
is there any question in your mind, but that the use of the Oreshnik was a direct response to?
Okay. We missed this section earlier. I went over it too quickly. But what the Russians did in this instance is they introduced a new missile. The name of the missile, is the Oreshnik. It wasn't an RS-24. It wasn't an RS-26. But it was a new missile they had never used, before. And one of the fearsome things about it was that it flew at very low altitude. So it was hard for radars to pick up. And it came in at hypersonic speeds at very low altitude. So it's just a new type of missile that I don't think anyone has had before, that the Russians just introduced into it. Yes, it could be configured as an ICBM. It could be configured as an IRBM. In this case, it was configured as an IRBM. It could be configured with nuclear warheads, or non-nuclear warheads. But it's quite a fearsome weapon, since it comes in at low altitude, very fast speed, hypersonic speed, and as you saw in some of the films before, it delivers a payload, of multiple explosives. It's a single warhead, but splits into 6 other warheads, and then hits the ground at frightening hypersonic speed. Going on.
to American use of ATACMS and British use of Storm Shadows reaching into Russia?
There's no doubt in my mind, and Putin said as such. I also communicated with some Russians. Apparently, the Storm Shadow attack struck a Russian command and control facility, and in the Kursk region, and there were Russian casualties.
Oh boy!
Russia is preparing murder charges against the British forces involved in Storm Shadow because there's no legality for their action. Great Britain is not in a state of war with Russia. And yet Great Britain has facilitated the deaths of Russians using British weapons. So the Russians are in the process of identifying these people, and they will charge them with murder. But they didn't destroy the command and control facility. It's still functioning. It's still doing its job. But the Ukrainians used the Storm Shadow, which is targeted by the United States and Great Britain, to strike a Russian command and control facility in Kursk, killing Russian soldiers. And this is undoubtedly what triggered Putin's response.
What was gained from the Western American, UK, NATO perspective by the use of the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow?
We have to look at the timing of this, Judge. This is very, because remember, the Biden administration had already rejected this scenario previously back in September.
Right. They did it in a way that publicly humiliated the British Prime Minister.
100%. And the reason why was stated clearly by Lloyd Austin, that these weapons will not change the outcome. They don't have the ability to change the outcome of what's happening on the battlefield, that the only way this war ends is with the Ukrainians and the Russians sitting down and negotiating an end. That was and the other thing is, if you use these weapons, you lead us down, the United States, down a path that takes us dangerously close to nuclear war. So wisely, the Biden administration said, we don't want to do this. We don't want to engage in that. Now, what changed? They're doing it now. Why? November 5th. There's the answer. And Judge, this is this interesting constitutional problem that we have here, because we have a presidential campaign where the winning candidate ran on a platform that clearly articulated that they wanted to get out of Ukraine, that they didn't want a nuclear confrontation with Russia, and that they were looking to limit the ability of NATO to impose foreign policy prerogatives on the United States. What we now have is a presidential administration, a lame duck administration, that's acting in direct opposite to the stated will of the people by their vote. And They're doing this not because there's a threat that they have to respond to. These are decisions of choice being made to directly contradict earlier policy decisions that were made back in then the question is, who is doing this? Is the president of the United States actually making this? There's a case that can be made that this man is of such diminished cognitive capacity that he's incapable of making the complicated decisions, that this is actually a coup d'etat being carried out by Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and here's the problem: unelected deep state.
Right.
The class of unelected permanent.
We talked about this the other day, Scott. Might these people, whoever they are, Lloyd Austin, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, others unknown and unnamed, be engaged in this horrific political tit for tat? You and your crazy Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, might be their thinking, negotiated this terrible deal with the Taliban, not with the government of Afghanistan, and it exploded on our watch. Well, guess what? We're going to push Ukraine into exploding on your watch. Might they have done something as thoughtless, heedless, immoral, unlawful, unconstitutional, and killing of innocents as that?
Yes, they have a name for what they're doing right now. It's called Trump proofing. They are Trump proofing NATO. They are Trump proofing Ukraine, and they are Trump proofing the deep state. They are making this problem so hard to resolve that Donald Trump thinks he wants to do one thing when he comes in office, but he'll be compelled to do something different because his hands will be tied. It's also predicated on the notion that Russia is bluffing, that because there are follow-on steps, and this is supposed to just be the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS is just phase one of a series of actions that we know. This is, look at Zelensky's victory plan. It was scoffed at prior to November 5th. Now it's become the official policy. And the first part of the victory plan was give him long-range missiles to strike Russian command and control. The second part, to extend NATO air defense coverage in to shoot down Russian missiles flying over Ukraine. The third part, to extend NATO air power in. Now you created a de facto no-fly zone over Ukraine, and then you bring in NATO ground troops. And on January 20th, when Donald Trump rolls into the office, NATO and Ukraine are one and the same. Ukraine is now a de facto member of NATO, and Donald Trump has to deal with that reality. This is what they're trying to accomplish, but it's all predicated on the understanding that Russia is bluffing, that every time you seek to escalate, Russia will back down. That's the importance of what Vladimir Putin just did. He didn't respond using Kinzhal missiles that he's already used, Caliber missiles, Oryx missiles, anything of that nature. He responded with a brand new missile that is a game changer, because this missile not just can strike any part of Ukraine, but any part of Europe, and it can't be intercepted. And he made that point. I will hit anywhere in Europe I need to hit. I will mirror any action taken. The decisions have already been made. There won't be a discussion. You attack, we immediately hit back with this missile or other new missiles that you don't know anything about. That's what's interesting here.
Do the Russians have ICBMs that could reach the mainland of the United States?
What's the fastest way to get relief for toenail fungus? Is it A,
God.
apple cider vinegar? Is it B, tea tree oil? Or is
Do they have ICBMs? Judge, they have more ICBMs than you can shake a stick at, including one called the Sarmat. We call it the Satan. This one is a giant missile. It carries 18 to 20 independently targeted warheads, each one about between 200 to 500 kilotons. Remember, the bomb that took out Hiroshima was 12 kilotons. The one that took out Nagasaki was 20. We're talking about hitting American cities with 200 to 500 kilotons each, 18 of them in one missile, and they've got regiments of these. The Russians have more missiles than you can shake a stick at. They're all modern missiles, all incorporate hypersonic technology. None of them can be shot down, and it's the death sentence to the United States. I don't know what these people are thinking.
Do these people?
Okay, so I really wanted you to hear that last. That was really so important and establishes so clearly that we're doing more than just playing with fire here. Our government is being suicidal. And given the idea, which I think is more and more true, that the cognitive capacities of Joe Biden are gone, my thought is, can we really expect to get through the next 60 days unharmed with Joe Biden as the president? Shouldn't the 24th Amendment be evoked, at this point, so that Biden is replaced by Harris for the final 60 days? I don't hold any particular brief for Harris or have a great deal of confidence in her, but I think at least she would have enough sense to listen to Lloyd Austin and accept the realities of the military situation, which he is evidently aware of, which he will tell her about. Then the decision will be in her hands. She will be the president, and the deep state will have no option except to go along with what she says. Obviously, at this point, they're manipulating Biden. It's not really him talking. He's beyond coherent thought. We cannot have a president for another 60 days who's beyond coherent thought. Also, the other thing we have to recognize is that the transition period we have now between November 5th and January 20th is obsolete. Now, we used to have, before the days of FDR, we had a transition period that was from, November to March. In other words, the president took over the presidency in March, so it was even longer. FDR shortened it to January 20th. But these days, things move much faster even than they did, in the 1930s. And obviously, this time of transition is much too long. In European governments, when governments change, the new party takes over the government in, I don't know what it is, 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. That is what we need here. I know people would like a vacation. I know they need time to think about this or do that. But in a situation like this, where we have someone who's incoherent, or someone who's trying to tie up the new administration and commitments they have made, we need to shorten the time of transition. But for now, what we need is for the vice president to invoke the 24th Amendment, and for the rest of the cabinet to vote to replace the president with the vice president. So at least we could have someone with minimal cognitive faculties in the presidency, someone who would not be quite so reckless. Okay, so I thought I had to say that. Go
People, Lloyd Austin, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, whoever the unnamed ones were. We're going to take Biden out of it because of his mental degradation. Do they understand what you're saying? Do they understand the gravity of what they have triggered?
They believe that Putin is bluffing. They believe that Putin, this whole nuclear doctrine that they signed off on, you hear it over and over again from Keir Starmer, British intelligence, Americans. It's just posturing by the Russians. They don't.
Now, why is that so irrational? Okay, I will explain. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that they're right in thinking that Putin is bluffing. There still is a likelihood or a probability that he is not bluffing. You're in a decision-making situation. Let's say the probability that he is not bluffing is only 5%. That's a very low probability. I would argue the probability he's not bluffing is much, much higher, because this attack seems to show that he is not bluffing. But let's say that there's a 5% chance that he's not bluffing and a 95% chance that he is bluffing. Now, what we have to do is we have to make a decision based on the probability that he, is not bluffing, and the cost of assuming he is bluffing when he is not bluffing. Well, what's the cost? The cost is the destruction of the world. The cost is a nuclear war that will destroy us all. So the expected value of making a decision that on the basis of the idea that he's bluffing, the expected value of that decision is horribly negative, because the cost of being wrong is so high. In other words, these people arrogantly think that they are right. But if they're not right, we're all gone. And there's an appreciable probability, whether you think it's 1% or 5% or 10% or 50% or higher than that, an appreciable probability that they are wrong. And they are irrational not to notice that their probability of being wrong is high enough that it brings the expected cost of being wrong into play in making a decision. So these people are flat out arrogant, and irrational. They don't belong in power. They have to be displaced. As soon as we can displace them for the sake of all our lives.
Have the ability to back it up. They don't want to back it up. Putin's weak. Putin's this. Putin's that. And Putin just came out and said, "That's our doctrine. We'll use it. And, here's our missile. It's nuclear capable in case we want to implement our doctrine. If you want to push it, the decisions have already been made." That's the scary part. Anybody who thinks that Putin's going to be running around frantically making phone calls to deal with whatever escalation is wrong. The decisions have been made. The orders have been given. It's automatic. It's not up to Russia to do anything different. Russia will be mirroring, this is Putin's words, mirroring the actions of the United States, NATO, and Ukraine. And whatever we do, there will be an immediate mirrored reaction that could bring down the world.
Who else is in cahoots with the U.S. and the British on this?
The French to some extent.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. There is something else I want to cover, though. It's another of the judge's programs where the guest this time is Colonel McGregor. And I want you to hear what Colonel McGregor has to say. But before I get into that, I'm going to look at your comments again. Evelyn says, I would say to Robert that even if Scott Ritter were biased, his interpretation of the current events are based on facts and expertise, specifically on the subject of weapons and war. He knows his stuff. We should listen and consider or disregard at our peril. And then Evelina says, irresponsible leadership. And you're absolutely right. Absolutely right, Evelina. And you were correct to point that out. But also, I think it's relevant to say, Scott Ritter may be biased towards the Russians or too friendly towards the Russians. But since Robert and most other people are listening all day to people who are obviously biased against the Russians from the get-go, and much more heavily biased against the Russians than Scott is towards the Russians, I don't think it would harm those people to take a listen to somebody who has a great deal of expertise and who might be somewhat more friendly to the Russians than he is. I mean, you have to listen to people who think differently from yourself from time to time to understand what the false aspects are of your own reasoning. So I think that is very important. Now I'm going to go to a final video that I want you to look at. I'll only be doing this for a few minutes because I have to go join Dee in her show. Okay. So.
Essentially a 50-mile radius. This is very serious stuff. I don't think Americans are aware of how seriously these threats that we have made and these attacks that we have sponsored and sought to execute have been taken in Russia. Remember, yesterday I told you that the nuclear forces of the Russian armed forces are in the highest state of alert that they've been in history.
You did.
They are serious. They are very worried. They think that we do want a war with them. They are convinced that we want to destroy them. Now, that may be true for some on the lunatic fringe in the White House or the Hill, but that is not true for the American people. It's not something they voted for. It's not something they want. And that's where we are right now. The churches in Russia are filling up. People are praying in Russia for peace. The government wants peace. Putin wants peace. They're not interested in attacking us or Western Europe. They never have been. But they are responding to what they see as an existential threat to the Russian society.
So that is a flat out statement by the colonel. I think most people would think that Colonel McGregor is a little less friendly to the Russians than Scott Ritter. But Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor are singing the same song. Also, Colonel McGregor is friendly to the Trump administration, okay, as well. He worked for the previous Trump administration, and I think he's still thinking that he would like to be appointed to the new Trump administration. That doesn't mean he's biased towards the Russians, but clearly, based on what he is saying, he is biased towards our survival. And it seems to me we should all be biased towards our survival. Isn't that what this is about? Do we really want to risk our survival over Ukraine, over whether Ukraine becomes a part of NATO or Ukraine gets into the EU? What is our national interest here? What are we doing? In the old days, when Russia was communist, the Soviet Union existed, there was this old saying, some of us would rather be better dead than red. Okay, you remember that? I mean, the real courageous among us would say, I'd rather be dead than red. And some other people would say, well, I don't think that's the choice, that we're either red or dead. There's got to be some third alternative. But there were even some people who said, well, look, as terrible as the Soviet Union is and living there is, you're still better off red than dead. That was the logical thing to think. Okay. I think this is a similar situation. We're better off, with Ukraine being dominated by Russia than we are being dead. And increasingly, that seems to be the kind of choice that we are presented with. Anyway, going on with the video.
Scott Ritter reports that an American admiral, a 4-star by the name of Buchanan, made an absurd statement this afternoon that we're prepared to engage in a nuclear conflict with Russia.
Okay, watch this.
A, if true, how could he make that without authorization from the Secretary of Defense or even the White House? B, the statement itself defies reality that we're prepared to get into a nuclear conflict with Russia. To what end? The destruction of humanity?
Well, the second question, you've provided the answer. That's absurd. There is no preparation for a nuclear war. A nuclear war would end life on this planet as we know it. It would be Armageddon. The Russians understand that, and we understand it. The Russians feel cornered by what we've done. They think we want to destroy them. They're prepared to fight as well as they can. But the first question, I think, is the most important one. What is this man doing? We've talked about this before. We have too many 4-star generals. We look like a banana republic. We have 43, 44 4-star generals and admirals on any given day. These all have headquarters ranging from hundreds to 1,000 people with all sorts of accoutrements and luxurious settings and expensive headquarters. All of these people are presiding over what is effectively military hegemony over the world. They have various areas of the world under their supervision, various fleets, various air forces, armies. And unfortunately, these are much smaller than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, when we had far fewer. But this thing has grown repeatedly, larger and larger. And now these 4-star officers think they are effectively Caesars in their own right, that they're policymakers. That's because we've essentially relegated the State Department and the diplomatic corps to tertiary importance. It's a catastrophe for us. This is why Diplomacy takes a back seat to military power, and military power is not used for defense. It's used to bully people, just as our trade, tariffs, sanctions, all of those things are designed to bully people, not to enhance our business with others, not to develop commercial relationships, to destroy people that we don't like. The world has had it with us. And this man, Buchanan, I don't know who he is, but he ought to be removed. It's not his place to make a public statement like that. But these people are accustomed to it. He's not the Lone Ranger. These are all demigods in their own right.
This is called a Shishibo cube, and let me show you what it does. Shishibo stands for shapeshift.
How I wish that the president-elect or his transition team is listening to you. You're such a voice of restraint, reason, and preparedness, Colonel. I don't want to get into the politics. Is there any question?
But I have to say, in response to that, Colonel McGregor is certainly not a peacenik. He's certainly not a peacenik. But because of the circumstances, he talks like a peacenik. He expresses himself like a peacenik. But Colonel McGregor, commander of tanks in the first Iraq War, is no peacenik.
In your mind, but that this device called the Oreshnik was fired in direct response to the American use of ATACMS inside Russia and the British use of Storm Shadows landing inside Russia.
Yes, this is unmistakable. This is a clear, unambiguous signal and message to us. Stop. The next round will not be conventional. The next rounds that fall on you could be nuclear. And we are prepared to do this. We will not submit to you. We will not surrender our sovereignty. We are Russians. We will fight. That's the message. Now, the real question for us is, what in the hell are we doing? We don't want to fight the Russians.
Colonel,
We've never wanted to do that.
I have to interrupt you. Russia is apparently taking seriously the statements by this Admiral Buchanan. And I'm now reading from, Chris, I don't know who this is from, but it looks like it's Sky or RT. Russia urges the United States to exercise restraint after Pentagon statement on exchange of nuclear strikes. Kremlin spokesman reiterates commitment to prevent nuclear conflict, calls on the West to adopt similarly responsible stance. The Russians are being responsible. The Americans are being reckless to the nth degree.
Well, these 4 stars have been coddled and treated as something more than they are, as though they occupy a position on Mount Olympus. The president of the United States, and I don't know who that is right now, because clearly I don't think President Biden knows what's going on. But certainly Lloyd Austin does. I don't know what his views are, but he ought to immediately inform this man to send in his papers. He is going to be retired from active duty immediately. He is removed from office. His deputy, whoever that is, should take over. That is the only action that will mean anything to the Russians. That needs to happen as soon as possible.
What kind of damage do you know this device, ICBM or whatever you want to call it, did?
Well, I don't know how exactly what the parameters of the damage is, because this is a conventional warhead. Remember, these are weapons that were originally designed for nuclear warheads. They're hypersonic, they can't be shot down, and they're designed to shower a target with multiple warheads that are nuclear, which means it's an annihilating strike. You would have seen something that dwarfs Hiroshima. That's what people have to understand. What you saw fall on Hiroshima or Nagasaki were modest in the scale of their destruction compared with what we would have seen if they'd put nuclear warheads on these missiles. This has got to stop. We don't want anything to happen like this. We want it to be over. This is not about who wins and who loses. Everyone loses in a nuclear exchange. We need to prevail upon these people in Kiev to stop. This government needs to stop. We need to get rid of any admirals or generals who are prepared to make reckless public statements. We've had this for too long. A lot of people today don't remember it. When Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, we had this General McPeak from the Air Force who made some reckless comments about reducing Iraq to ashes or a parking lot or something. The Air Force could win the war all on its own, didn't need anybody else. And he was removed just for saying that. And he was replaced by somebody named Fogelman. This is far more serious, Judge. This man is making pronouncements that the Russians think are policy pronouncements. Men in uniform do not make policy. That has to be made very clear. This is out of control.
This person is
Watch this before trying the keto diet. People try to eat a low-carb diet, but they inject
U.S. Strategic Command spokesman, Rear Admiral Thomas Buchanan. There he is. Now, I'd never heard of this fellow. I don't know if you have. He's a Rear Admiral, so he's not 4 stars. I was mistaken on that. Colonel, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the most serious, how serious has this become in the past 3 days?
10.
Oh.
This Rear Admiral, who's probably a 2-star, and they have Rear Admiral upper half, lower half in the Navy. I suspect he's a 1 or a 2. Not only should he be instantly removed from his position, whoever his boss is, whoever the 4-star in charge is, he should be removed. You've got to make an example of this. These people do not make policy. That spokesman would never have said a thing like that unless he was comfortable doing so.
Right.
The only way he could be comfortable is if he heard his boss make these statements.
What good was accomplished by President Biden or someone in his name authorizing the use of the American ATACMS, programmed by Americans, fired by Americans, and the comparable behavior by the Prime Minister of Great Britain? What conceivable good came from that, from their perspective?
I think these people are confused, and they think that somehow or another they are signaling how strong they are as leaders. This doesn't signal anything but sheer stupidity. This is more bluster and bluff that they ought to restrain. You know, it's hard to even fathom this. I can't imagine anyone back in the 1960s or 70s making comments like this. Everyone seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, and people that didn't were ultimately removed. These people don't know what they're doing. This man, I guess it's Strike Command, has no business making these statements. Policy rests exclusively with the civilian leadership, elected and appointed. Now, these appointed and elected leaders, if they're behind this, then they are suicidal. They are psychopaths. There is no win in this war. Nothing good has been accomplished for Ukraine. Because of us, because of our insistence on trying to harm Russia, millions of people have been driven from their homes. Millions of people have been hurt, harmed, either physically or otherwise. We don't know how many have died. The media have never told the truth. It's at least 600,000-700,000 dead Ukrainians, at least, and hundreds of thousands more wounded who will never recover. No one is telling the truth. It's time for the truth. If President Trump does anything, he's got to tell the truth and throw out anyone who doesn't provide him with the truth.
I think asking President Trump to tell the truth is a tall order. But I do agree with Doug. President Trump has to tell the truth, and the news media at last have to begin to tell the truth, have to begin to describe the reality of this war and the impact of it on Ukraine, okay, and the Ukrainians. The idea that a country starts out a conflict like this with 40 million people in it and now has only 18 million people left in it and has sustained battle casualties of between 600 and 700,000 people. That is failure, abject failure.
Don't want to aggravate you further, but now we have a direct quote from him. I don't know who General Cotton is, but he says, now this is Admiral Buchanan saying, General Cotton has designated 2024 as the year of action, and 2025 now becomes the year of acceleration, and we are moving out on that end. If and when directed by the president, we are ready to prevail in conflict. Make no bones about it. That's what our forces, your forces, the Air Force, Navy forces that make up the three legs of the triad do every day. Prepare for that potential eventuality. The potential eventuality of which he speaks is nuclear. This is lunacy.
Well, Judge, first of all, the last part of his statement is correct. They're expected to be ready to fight. That's not the issue here. What's strange is the necessity to say it publicly in the way he has.
Right.
Do you understand? I mean, everybody in uniform is always expected to be ready to fight. That is everyone from private through 4 stars, regardless of service. But to come forth now and make that statement in connection with the previous statement that we're prepared for nuclear war at a point in time when the Russians have taken this very seriously and have sent this unmistakable message is extremely ill-advised. It's unwarranted. It should be stopped.
Does the
Someone
Pentagon
has to get control? This government is on autopilot. Who the hell is in charge?
Right. Well, we don't know who's in charge, Colonel, as you pointed out a little while ago.
Okay, that's enough, I think. I have to get over to Dee's to help her. I will look at your final comments. Oh, there aren't any more comments, but you're all still here. There are 55 of you still here, so that's good. But anyway, I hope the various points from Doug and Scott are quite clear. What we're experiencing now in terms of the actions of the United States is we're experiencing madness, among our leadership. We're experiencing a leadership that cannot see the forest because it's completely focused on the trees. It's a leadership that has to be replaced as soon as possible. It's a leadership that in the last 60 days has to be brought to sanity, because right now it is risking all our lives for what seems to most of us to mean very little. That is, whether Ukraine, is in the bloc of nations that's friendly to Russia, or whether it's in the bloc of nations that's friendly to the United States. How important is that to you? How important is it to you? I'll tell you that to me, it's not important, at all. And as far as people who say, well, Ukraine is a democracy and we're trying to save a democracy, that's BS. Ukraine has been a dictatorship for years now. There is no democracy there. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of press, nor would there be if they won. They were a regime that was oppressive to the Russian citizens of Ukraine. They outlawed most of the political parties. The dominant people there that had political power a large proportion of them were neo-Nazis. What have we been defending in the first place there? It shouldn't mean anything to us. It's been a grift. It's been something that has benefited a lot of people there because all the money we shipped over to Ukraine, I think I heard some estimate the other day that it's something like $235 billion altogether. A lot of people here benefited from that because a lot of that money came back. Okay, that's where it was a grift. Lana says, Ukraine is our pawn in this ugly game. Very, very sad. Not just sad, but threatening to our own lives at this point. As Doug McGregor said, it must stop. It must stop now. There is no other sensible alternative for us to call for. And that's what I am calling for tonight. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to go over to Dee's now to help her out. So thank you all very much for coming. And I'm going to end the stream at this point.